How does Alessio? Hope you're well. In this video, I want to briefly mention the chart of Bitcoin. So we'll just briefly cover this at the beginning of this video, especially this most recent drop that has occurred, and explain what this likely structure is on Bitcoin. And then I want to dig into this really fascinating and important chart and explain to you what this potentially means in the next several weeks and months, especially in the coming months as we get closer to the election in the US. All right, guys, join me. Alright guys, welcome back. So before we begin to the other chart I want to talk about, which is quite important, let me just briefly mention this particular chart here on Bitcoin. So as you can see here, I've zoomed out all the way to September of last year. We can see we're still above this trend line support. So even though we temporarily broke this trend line some weeks ago in early July, nevertheless, that was a false break. And as I've explained, that was actually part of the C wave drop on that correction. So we dropped to that trend line support. Nevertheless, we managed to bounce back. And once again, notice we're now still at that trend line support right there. We're holding it at the moment. And the key question is now, can Bitcoin now stay above key support here around about the lows of July? In any case, the fact is at the moment we still have an uptrend. By the way, what I have here is the non-logarithmic standard chart of Bitcoin. And the reason is I prefer non-logarithmic charts when I'm looking at trend lines because you can see trend lines a bit better on standard non-logarithmic charts. Now, what is also interesting, by the way, guys, as I'm sure you know, is that this was an ABC correction, which by the way, we foresaw. So this was the likely A wave down. And then this was the 100% projection of the A wave from the top of the B wave. In fact, let me show you. You can actually do this yourself. If you go ahead and grab the trend-based web extension and then just drag it from the top. So if you just do it from the beginning of March down to the lows we had here, and then, place that at the top of the B wave. That gives you, as you can see there, the 100% projection. So that gives you the 100% projection of the A wave. In other words, measuring that drop here, okay, that gives you the 100% projection right about there. By the way, you may remember we called this in real time back in June. We said that if Bitcoin drops down below 65 or 64K, then very likely we're in a C wave structure of a large ABC pattern. In fact, here's a very brief clip of that members video. We'll come back. So what does this mean? It means that my earlier analysis that I've been saying for the last several weeks, that this was a likely A wave down, and this is a B wave bounce. So bottom line is, just keeping it simple, I think it's quite likely there's AB, and this would mean a C wave is likely beginning or indeed on its way towards lower levels, towards 54K to 55K. In other words, that is at the moment my higher probability. That to me is the more likely wave count. A wave, B wave, okay, and a C wave taking us down, likely into this region. Okay, the region between 55,000 142 to 54K, 54,644. We have a lot of support right into this region here. So 55 to 54K seems to be the more likely support. Okay, and by the way, that would be the 100% projection of the A wave down too. All right, guys, as you heard there, we were looking for an ABC structure, and indeed this was our ABC structure. So let me just put this on the chart. By the way, sometimes C waves, just to bear in mind, sometimes C waves can extend beyond the 100% projection. Something to bear in mind as well. Okay, so far so good. Now let's zoom in on that chart a bit more, and we can see it much more clearly here. In fact, notice something, that this rally, which started off from this low we had here in July, okay, and this rally, very beautiful rally so far. And I mentioned in the member video recently, in fact, this was last week's video, I warned that this most recent bounce that we had here, in other words, I mentioned this bounce from the 21 EMA here, this bounce. I said this was very likely to be a B wave, and I'm sure you know what B waves are. B waves are typically bull traps. Let me play for you a very brief clip on my video from last week, from last Sunday, and we'll come back. I think this is part of an ABC structure, as I mentioned earlier. This could be A wave down, B wave, and as long as we stay below 72K, we may see a C wave drop to retest the lows here near 63,412 to potentially this region here to about 61,194. This region for the C wave, and we'll see if this level holds. By the way, the C wave may extend a bit lower to, for example, 59,228, but I think this tends to be a more stronger support level based on what I'm seeing based on the extensions and the projections. All right, guys, so as you heard in that video, again, we anticipated this bounce that occurred was very likely to be a B wave bounce. One of the reasons why I thought this is a B wave In other words, one of the reasons why I thought this is A wave down, B wave to be followed by a C wave, okay, is because it's quite simple. The reason is that this initial drop here, okay, was just too short in time to be a correction to this previous rally, okay? So usually corrections after strong rallies like this do not just last a few days. So in other words, the temporal perspective as well came into play. And also the nature of this rally here just seemed to me, again, because of a three-wave corrective structure, it just seemed to me that it was likely a bull trap. In other words, a B-wave structure. So far, so good. So far, we anticipated this drop here to support levels. In other words, so far, this appears to be part of an A, B, C structure. Okay. Anyway, so far, this C wave of the ABC structure appears to have retraced about 50% or 61.8% of the previous rally. And we'll see if this level holds. We'll see if it wants to hold on to this trend line support. And very importantly, Bitcoin needs to stay above this very important support region here between 56 to about 54K. That's going to be very important. That's key support. It needs to protect that level. But so far, the pullback here on Bitcoin appears to be corrective at the moment here. So as long as it stays above support, it looks like a correction, a corrective pattern. Okay, so far so good. Let me now show you the chart I really want to talk about in this video. What you're seeing here is the seasonality of Bitcoin for this month we're in August. Now, as it happens, the chart I really want to talk about is not August, but September and October. And I'll explain to you why in a few minutes. But let me just explain to you. By the way, this chart is courtesy of Jason Geppert. I want to give credit to him because he's a fantastic analyst. And I think these tools and charts that he provides are just excellent, really useful and powerful. And this particular chart you're seeing here, so what I've done here is I've selected Bitcoin seasonality going from, as you can see here on the chart. So I've selected the date range from 2009, 2024. As I'm sure you know, the data on Bitcoin goes back to 2009 anyway. So that's why I've done 2009, 2024. So we got plenty of data for seasonality. And as you can see here, I put it for the month of August. Now, in a few minutes, we'll go on to September and October, which are much more interesting and much more powerful. But let me just explain to you what you see here on this chart essentially means. So firstly, the green you see here on this chart shows to you the average return in percentages. So essentially, whenever you see a green, these green bars on this chart shows to you when Bitcoin has been positive, when it's been rallying on specific days of the week in August. Okay, and of course, reds show declines, show negative returns. Okay, so for example, you can see that typically, again, in the beginning of August, so in the first half, there seems to be a bit more greens than reds, okay? A bit more positive returns than negative returns. And notice, by the way, the first part of August is usually negative, and it was, as I'm sure you know, the first part of August so far has been rather negative, the big decline we saw on Bitcoin recently. But essentially from this chart, it seems the first part of August going to the middle of August seems to be more positive than negative. However, I should say, we should also pay attention to the next factor. The next factor is something called percentage positive. And that's the blue line. The blue line you see on the chart, percentage positive, which also means win rates. So these blue lines, this blue line you're seeing here, this very zigzaggy, choppy line, shows to you the win rate or percentage positive for Bitcoin. And notice the percentage positive is actually very low. So even though you see some green bars here, the percentage positive or the win rate is still rather low. It's rather average. It's in the 50 to 60% range. Now, the win rate, this blue line, seems to improve towards the end of August, the last few days of August, it seems. But I should say that this chart for me doesn't speak much. So for me, the seasonality for Bitcoin in August is not the one we should pay attention to because it's very mixed, very hodgepodge. So this particular chart is not that important. So I'm not going to place too much reliance on it. For me, what's really important is what's going on for the months. In particular, I want to show you the months of September and October. Let's go to September. Okay, now take a look at this. This is really fascinating. And immediately, I think you'll see something very clear on this chart of seasonality of Bitcoin for September. And typically, in fact, this data, again, remember, this data goes back from 2009, 2024. So there's a lot of data here. So what this data shows to us, the seasonality of Bitcoin in September is really poor, really bad in the first half of September, specifically from about the 3rd of September all the way to 11th of September. Okay. So, and by the way, look at the win rate. The win rate is really bad. Really low. As you can see, the blue line. So not only do we have red bars, a lot of negative returns in this period, in the first half of September, but notice the win rate is also bad. So it tends to improve a little bit, maybe on the 12th of September. But again, remember, these are not certainties or probabilities. Okay. So what is interesting, though, is that generally in September, overall, you see a lot more reds than greens. In fact, if you just take a look over here, you'll see hardly any greens, just a few, just a handful, probably. So as you see here, there are much more reds in September than there are greens, which means that in September, we should expect a lot more volatility and perhaps much more risk in that month. That also makes sense because in the stock markets, we also see more risk and more volatility in September. Usually September is a negative month for the stock markets too, okay? So not just Bitcoin. So bottom line is, guys, what this chart is saying to us, because the negative win rate, especially in the first half of September, and generally because there's much more reds than greens, it shows to us we need to be very careful about Bitcoin when it comes to September. So we might see more risk. We might see a decline, perhaps. Perhaps. This is by no means certain. Okay. We need to combine seasonality with charts. Okay. Seasonality is one factor, but we need to combine this with chart analysis as well. But it does warn to us. It does make us cautious that September could be perhaps a negative month, generally for Bitcoin. By the way, you will notice that the win rate generally seems to be in this range between 60 to 50%, as you can see here. Rather average. Okay. Now it does go up a little bit on specific days, but generally the win rate is really low, as you can see from that blue line on the chart. Really low. And also in this range, you'll see that again, typically the win rate seems to be in the again in the average zone, in the mid zones. But look what happens when we go to the month of October. This is really interesting. Look what happens to the chart. Okay, now I think you'll see something automatically hit your eye. Okay, and maybe you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing, which is that first of all, you'll see much more greens on the chart than reds. A massive difference. It's like you're seeing something completely different to September. Let me just show you one more time, just in case you didn't see it. Okay, so that's October. Again, let's go back to September. So you'll see something very different, dramatically different. In September, much more reds than greens. But in October, again, you'll see in October a lot more greens than reds. And notice this, not only do you see much more, so much more greens than reds in October, in other words, much more positive returns in October than negative ones, the win rate improves. The percentage positive improves in October too. In fact, you will see that the percentage positive is mostly in the 70 to 80% range, in the upper range. Okay, so whereas in September, the win rate was rather average, more in the mid-range. Actually, it was a lot of negatives, as we know, in September. But look at this, the win rate, the percentage positive, improves significantly in the upper zones, in the 70 to 80% range, as you can see. Especially you see the win rate improve from the second week of October all the way to the end. So this should be a good sign for Bitcoin for October. In other words, guys, what this means is if you're looking for the more favorable period for Bitcoin, then September is not going to be your best bet. August, probably not that much either, but again, August was very mixed, as you saw yourself. August was very much a mixed bag, very hodgepodge. To me, it does not speak to me much. It's not very clear, okay? So I would ignore August, really. I would focus more on something which is much more substantive. September, as you can see here, very much negative overall. Now, maybe this year might be different. As I mentioned, these are probabilities, not certainties. So it doesn't mean necessarily that Bitcoin has to drop in September this year. It might be different. But again, statistically and historically speaking, the month of September is rather unfavorable, rather negative in September. It doesn't mean one should sell and get out of Bitcoin in September. No, it does not mean that. All it means is we should be very cautious in September. That's what it means, okay? And as far as October is concerned, yeah, I mean, you saw it for yourself. October was just beautiful. So October is going to be a much better bet for bulls out there. So if you're bullish on Bitcoin, then October is going to be perhaps a better month for you, especially as we head into the latter half, the second part of October, okay? The win rate improves and there's far more, generally there seems to be much more greens than reds, more win rates, higher win rates, especially as we head in the latter half, in the second part of October. All right, guys, let me know your thoughts about these two charts I just showed, the seasonality chart for Bitcoin. Let me know what you think. And by the way, in tomorrow's members video, we'll dig into the chart of Bitcoin from an Elliott wave perspective and look at the potential wave counts and likely targets for Bitcoin as well. By the way, guys, if you haven't yet subscribed to our videos here on YouTube, if you haven't yet clicked the bell icon, please do so you'll be notified of my next future video updates as well. Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to seeing the next video update. Bye for now.